June 26, 1943. Somewhere over the coast of Normandy, France, 20,000 feet above the English Channel. A lone P-47 Thunderbolt is on fire. Hydraulic fluid sprays across the shattered instrument panel. The canopy is gone, ripped away by a 20 cannon shell that missed the pilot's skull by 3 inches. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, 23 years old, former grocery store clerk from Lawton, Oklahoma, is bleeding from his face, his hands, his legs. Behind him, an FW-190 closes in for the kill. The German pilot squeezes the trigger. Bullets slam into the Thunderbolt's fuselage like a jackhammer punching through tin. 1 burst, 2 bursts, 3, 4, 5. The German empties everything he has into that burning American fighter. He pulls alongside, slides his canopy back, and stares. He expects wreckage. He expects a dead man slumped over a shattered stick. Instead, he sees Robert Johnson staring right back at him alive, bleeding, furious, and still flying. The German shakes his head. He has never seen anything like this. He rolls away and disappears into the clouds. When Johnson lands at Manston Airfield in England, 40 minutes later, ground crews begin counting bullet holes in his aircraft. They stop at 221. 221 holes. Entire control surfaces shredded. Engine cowling punctured in 17 places. Oxygen system destroyed. Radio gone. And yet this 7-ton beast of American steel carried its pilot home. This is not a war story about a lucky man. This is the story of the most ridiculed fighter aircraft of World War II. The plane every German pilot laughed at, the machine that American brass almost canceled, the 7-ton monster that a Georgian immigrant designed in a basement office in Long Island, New York, and the weapon that would ultimately destroy the Luftwaffe. By May 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts had flown 546,000 combat sorties, dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, destroyed 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, and shot down 3 752 enemy aircraft. It had the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in the European theater. All from a plane they called the Flying Milk Bottle. How did that happen? To answer that question, you have to go back 3 years, before Robert Johnson's impossible survival. You have to go back to the summer, when the world learned what modern air power could do, and what it felt like to have absolutely nothing that could stop it. Summer, 1940. France has fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force has been chased off the continent at Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe owns the sky over Western Europe, with a grip so tight that Allied planners cannot even imagine how to break it. In London, intelligence officers spread photographs across long wooden tables. The images show columns of destroyed vehicles stretching for miles along French roads. Entire divisions wiped out, not by tanks, not by infantry, but by aircraft. Stukas screaming down from 12,000 feet, a Messerschmitt 100 and 9 strafing convoys, Focke-Wulf 190 cutting through bomber formations like wolves through sheep. The numbers are staggering. During the fall of France, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 1,400 Allied aircraft in just 46 days. The French Air Force, once considered among the best in Europe, ceased to exist as a fighting force within 3 weeks. Poland had lost 333 aircraft in the first week of invasion. Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, all swept aside from the air before their ground forces could organize a coherent defense. American military attachés stationed in London send urgent cables back to Washington. The message is blunt. The United States possesses no fighter aircraft capable of challenging German air superiority at altitude. The P-39. Airacobra, the Army's frontline fighter, struggles above 15,000 feet. The P-40 Warhawk, tough and reliable in a low-altitude dogfight, becomes sluggish and underpowered above 20,000. Neither aircraft can escort bombers into the heart of Germany. Neither can survive sustained combat against the Messerschmitt 109F, which operates comfortably at 30,000 feet, with superb climb rate and devastating 20 mm cannon armament. General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the Army Air Corps, reads these reports, and understands the arithmetic of what is coming. America will enter this war. Yeah, American bombers will fly daylight missions over Germany. And without a fighter that can protect them at extreme altitude, those bombers will be slaughtered. He needs a new weapon. He needs it fast. And the man who will build it is someone almost nobody in Washington has ever heard of. Alexander Kartveli was not a name that appeared in newspapers. He was not a celebrity engineer like Kelly Johnson at Lockheed or Ed Heinemann at Douglas. He was a quiet, intense Georgian-born immigrant who had fled the Russian Revolution as a young man, studied aeronautical engineering in Paris, and eventually found his way to a small aircraft company on Long Island called Republic Aviation. By 1940, Kartveli was Republic's chief designer, a man known for two things among his colleagues. First, he never raised his voice. Second, he never designed anything small. His previous creation, the P-43 Lancer, had shown promise at altitude, but lacked the power, the armament, and the structural strength to survive real combat. The Army had ordered a limited run and moved on. Kartveli took the rejection personally. He spent months studying combat reports from Europe, poring over technical intelligence on German engines, German airframes, German tactics, and somewhere in those late nights at his drafting table in Farmingdale, New York, he arrived at a conclusion that contradicted everything conventional fighter design taught. Every other designer in America was trying to build lighter, smaller, more agile aircraft. Kartveli decided to go the opposite direction. He would build the biggest, heaviest, most powerful single-engine fighter the world had ever seen. His reasoning was elegant in its brutality. At 30,000 feet, agility means nothing. The air is too thin for tight turns. Engines lose power, wings lose lift. What matters at that altitude is raw horsepower, structural integrity, and the ability to carry enough firepower to destroy an enemy in a single pass. Kartveli designed his new fighter around the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine, an 18-cylinder radial power plant that produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly twice the output of the Merlin engine in a Spitfire. To make that engine perform at extreme altitude, he integrated a General Electric turbocharger system that ran through the entire belly of the aircraft, a complex network of ducts and intercoolers that maintained sea-level power above 30,000 feet. Then, he packed 8 M2 Browning .50 caliber heavy machine guns into the wings, 4 per side with a combined rate of fire exceeding 6,000 rounds per minute. The total ammunition load was 400 rounds. For comparison, a Messerschmitt 109 carried approximately 300 rounds for its cannon, and 1000 rounds for its light machine guns. The Thunderbolt could sustain fire 5 times longer than any German fighter in the sky. When the prototype rolled out of the Republic factory in May 1941, the reaction was immediate and almost universally negative. Army officials stared at the aircraft in something close to disbelief. It weighed over 12,000 pounds empty, nearly double the weight of a Spitfire. Its fuselage was so wide that test pilot Lowry Brabham joked he needed a map to find the instrument panel. Republic's own engineers privately called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that stuck not as a compliment, but as an acknowledgement that this machine was something entirely outside the normal vocabulary of fighter aviation. Military procurement officers questioned whether a fighter this large could even perform basic combat maneuvers. One report noted that the XP-47B had a turning radius more appropriate for a medium bomber than a pursuit aircraft. The British, shown specifications during a wartime technical exchange, declined interest with polite firmness. Their test pilots later described it as a machine more suited to breaking through walls than engaging in aerial combat. Kartveli said nothing. He let the numbers speak. In early flight tests, the XP-47B reached 412 miles per hour in level flight at 25,000 feet, making it the fastest American fighter in existence. Its dive speed exceeded 500 miles per hour, a figure so extreme that engineers initially suspected instrument error. At 35,000 feet, where German fighters gasped for power, the Thunderbolt flew as if it owned the sky. The Army ordered 773 aircraft, but building the machine was one thing. Learning to fly it was something else entirely. Between November 1942 and March 1943, training squadrons at bases across the eastern United States struggled to master the Thunderbolt. The aircraft demanded respect in a language measured in broken airframes and lost pilots. Its massive torque could roll an unwary student inverted during takeoff. Its weight made it unforgiving on landing, with ground loops that snapped landing gear and sent 7 tons of metal cartwheeling across the tarmac. In those 4 months, Republic Aviation recorded 41 training accidents, resulting in total aircraft loss. 16 pilots killed before they ever saw combat. The statistics fed a growing skepticism within the Army Air Forces. Officers openly questioned whether the P-47 was a viable combat aircraft or an expensive engineering mistake. Maintenance crews complained about the turbocharger system, which required constant attention and frequently failed under the stress of repeated high-altitude runs. Pilots transferred from P-40 units found the Thunderbolt's controls sluggish at low speed and its cockpit intimidating in its complexity. Whispers circulated through training bases that the P-47 program would be quietly shelved in favor of the lighter, more conventional P-51 Mustang, then entering development. Cardvelli heard the whispers. He responded by showing up personally at operational training units, sitting with pilots, walking them through the aircraft systems, and repeating a single message. Do not fly this aircraft like a P-40. Do not try to turn fight. Do not engage below 15,000 feet. Climb high. Dive fast. Hit hard. Leave. The aircraft will do the rest. Most pilots listened politely and ignored him. They would learn the truth the hard way over the skies of occupied Europe. April 8, 1943. The 4th Fighter Group flying P-47C. Thunderbolts crossed the English Channel for the first time on a fighter sweep over northern France. It was the Thunderbolt's combat debut in the European theater. The mission was a disaster. The inexperienced American pilots, trained in tactics designed for lighter, more agile aircraft, attempted to engage FW-190S in turning dogfights at 15,000 feet, precisely the kind of combat the Thunderbolt was never designed to win. 3 P-47S were shot down. No German aircraft were destroyed. Over the following 6 weeks, losses continued to mount. By early May, Thunderbolt units had lost 28 aircraft in combat, while claiming only 12 confirmed kills, a ratio that horrified Allied planners and delighted Luftwaffe intelligence. German pilots gave the P-47 a nickname that spread through fighter units across France and the Low Countries. They called it the Iron Bathtub. Luftwaffe, after action reports, noted the American fighter's inability to match the FW-190 in turning radius, its poor climb rate below 20,000 feet, and its apparent vulnerability when caught at medium altitude. One German pilot wrote in his combat diary that engaging a Thunderbolt was like shooting a barn large, slow, and unable to dodge. The Luftwaffe concluded with considerable confidence that the Americans had committed a fundamental design error. This assessment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of the entire air war. Because by mid-June 1943, something began to change. A handful of American squadron commanders, men like Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group and Don Blakesley of the 4th Fighter Group, stopped trying to fight the German way. They started fighting the Thunderbolt way. Climb to 30,000 feet. Wait above the clouds. Spot the enemy below. Roll inverted. Dive at 500 miles per hour. Open fire at 300 yards with all 8 guns. Pull up. Climb back to altitude. Repeat. The Germans had a term for what happened next. They called it der Absturz, the collapse. In a single week in late June, the 56th Fighter Group shot down 19 German fighters while losing only 2 Thunderbolts. The kills were not close engagements. They were executions. 8.50 caliber machine guns, converging into a cone of fire 6 feet wide, delivering a combined weight of metal that could saw an aircraft in half in less than 2 seconds. W-190S that had dominated the Channel coast for 2 years began falling from the sky in pieces. But this was only the beginning. The real nightmare for the Luftwaffe had not yet arrived.
because in the autumn of 1943, the Thunderbolt was about to meet its deadliest targets, yet deep inside Germany, where the air was thin, the cold was absolute, and the greatest aces of the Third Reich waited with 200 victories each, and the certainty that no American fighter could touch them at altitude. They were wrong. And in Part 2, we will show you exactly how wrong they were. In Part 1, you watched a 7-ton fighter, built by a Georgian immigrant, get laughed at by every pilot who saw it nearly canceled by the army that ordered it, and mocked by every German who faced it. Then, Robert Johnson took 221 bullets over Normandy and flew home. Then, Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group killed 19 German fighters in a single week using tactics nobody had tried before. The Thunderbolt had drawn first blood, but blood was not enough. Because in the autumn of 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing the air war over Germany, and losing it badly. In a single week of October 1943, American bomber formations suffered losses so catastrophic that planners in London considered halting deep penetration raids altogether. 148 B-17s destroyed. Over 1,500 airmen killed, captured, or missing. The Luftwaffe was not just fighting back. It was winning. And the men who commanded America's fighter groups were about to face an enemy far more dangerous than any Messerschmitt. They were about to fight their own generals. October 14th, 1943. The date would become known as Black Thursday. 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses crossed into German airspace, heading for the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. They flew without fighter escort. The reason was simple and devastating. No American fighter had the range to follow the bombers beyond the German border. The P-47 Thunderbolt, for all its power, carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. That gave it a combat radius of approximately 175 miles from its base in England. Schweinfurt was 450 miles away. The bombers flew the last 275 miles alone. The Luftwaffe was waiting. 300 German fighters organized into layered attack formations hit the bomber stream in waves. Bf-109S struck from head-on at combined closing speeds, exceeding 600 miles per hour. FW-190S attacked from the flanks, rolling through the formations with 20 mm cannon blazing. Twin-engine Bf-110S stood off at long range and fired 210 mm rockets into the tightly packed bomber boxes. The result was a slaughter. 60 B-17S shot down, 17 more damaged beyond repair, 594 men gone in a single afternoon. When the surviving crews landed in England that evening, the faces of the ground personnel told the story. Entire hardstands sat empty. Barracks that had been full that morning now held the belongings of men who would never return. At 8th Air Force headquarters in High Wycombe, the arguments exploded behind closed doors. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th, faced pressure from every direction. Washington demanded results. The British demanded proof that daylight bombing could work. His own staff demanded a solution to the fighter escort problem or an end to the deep raids. Colonel Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was summoned to a conference at the 8th Fighter Command headquarters 3 days after Black Thursday. The meeting was not a discussion. It was an interrogation. Brigadier General Frank Hunter, who had led Fighter Command through its early months, had already established doctrine. Fighters existed to sweep the sky ahead of the bombers. Fighters did not chase individual targets. Fighters maintained formation discipline above all else. Zemke stood in a room full of senior officers and said what many of his pilots had been saying for weeks. "The doctrine is killing our bomber crews, sir. We are sweeping empty sky while the Germans wait until we turn back, and then they massacre the formations. We need to go further. We need to stay longer. And when we find the enemy, we need to be free to hunt them not locked in formation, flying parallel to bombers we cannot protect." The response was immediate and hostile. Hunter's staff pointed to regulations. Fighter formations existed for mutual protection. Breaking formation invited losses. Freelancing was indiscipline. One colonel told Zemke directly that his job was to follow orders, not redesign. The air war Zemke pressed harder. He laid out the numbers. In October alone, the 8th Air Force had lost over 100 heavy bombers.
At that rate, the entire bomber force would be destroyed within 4 months. The current escort system was a failure. The P-47 needed drop tanks to extend its range. Pilots needed freedom to engage targets of opportunity. The rigid formation sweeps had to end. He was told to return to his unit and focus on his assigned missions. The meeting was over. But Zemke did not stop. He found an ally in a man who had just arrived in England with a reputation for ignoring rules that did not produce results. Major General William Kepner had taken command of the 8th Fighter Command in September 1943, replacing Hunter. Kepner was a former balloon pilot, a paratrooper, and a man who had earned his wings in an era when aviation was still closer to carnival stunt than military science. He had no patience for doctrine that produced body counts instead of victories. When Zemke brought him the same arguments that Hunter's staff had rejected, Kepner listened. He studied the loss reports. He reviewed the combat films. He examined the German tactical patterns. And in November 1943, he issued an order that rewrote the rules of American air combat in Europe. Kepner's directive was deceptively simple. Fighter groups escorting bomber formations were authorized to break formation and pursue enemy aircraft aggressively. Drop tanks would be procured and fitted to extend the P-47's combat radius. Pilots who engaged and destroyed enemy fighters would be credited and celebrated, not disciplined. The famous sign that Kepner hung in his office summarized the new philosophy in 9 words. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. It was not a suggestion. It was a declaration of war within a war. Not every commander agreed. Several senior officers at 8th Air Force headquarters viewed Kepner's order as reckless. They argued that freeing fighters from close escort would leave bombers more vulnerable, not less. They pointed to the losses that occurred when fighter cover was thin. They warned that aggressive pursuit tactics would lead to higher fighter casualties. Kepner's answer was blunt. The current system had produced the worst bomber losses in the history of American aviation. Doing more of the same was not caution. It was suicide. The P-47 groups received the new orders in late November. For Zemke's 56th Fighter Group and the other Thunderbolt units scattered across eastern England, the directive changed everything. They were no longer defensive escorts tethered to bomber formations. They were hunters. December 1st, 1943. The 8th Air Force launched a major raid against industrial targets in western Germany. For the first time, P-47 Thunderbolts carried 75-gallon drop tanks under their bellies, extending their combat radius to approximately 325 miles. It was not enough to reach Schweinfurt, but it was enough to push deep into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the German war machine. The 56th Fighter Group put 48 Thunderbolts into the air that morning. Zemke positioned his squadrons at 30,000 feet, well above the bomber stream, and waited. At 11:47 hours, radar controllers reported a large formation of German fighters assembling east of Düren. Zemke gave the order. Drop tanks fell away. Throttles advanced. 48 P-47S rolled inverted and dove into the German formation from 6 miles above. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. The 56th Fighter Group destroyed 17 German fighters. They lost 1 P-47. The pilot survived. At 30,000 feet, the physics were absolute. The Thunderbolt's R-2800 engine force, fed by its turbocharger, produced full power in air so thin that German engines were choking. The P-47 weighed 7 tons, and when that weight tilted downward from 30,000 feet, it accelerated to speeds that no German fighter could match. 500 miles per hour, 520. In those screaming dives, the Thunderbolt became a projectile, with wings carrying 8.50 caliber machine guns that converged at 300 yards into a stream of destruction that no aircraft could survive. The Germans adapted. Within weeks, Luftwaffe tacticians ordered their pilots to avoid combat above 25,000 feet whenever possible. They developed stacking techniques, positioning fighters at multiple altitudes to catch diving Thunderbolts as they pulled out.
They assigned dedicated spotter aircraft to warn of high-altitude American formations. None of it worked. On December 11, 1943, the Thunderbolts found them again. This time, the 56th Fighter Group encountered a formation of Bf-110 heavy fighters preparing to launch rocket attacks against a B-17 formation near Emden. The twin-engine Messerschmitts were deadly against bombers, but helpless against single-engine fighters. Zemke's pilots hit them from above and behind. In 4 minutes, 9 Bf-110s were destroyed. Wreckage rained down over the German countryside in pieces so small that ground recovery teams could not identify individual aircraft. The kill ratio for December was staggering. The 56th Fighter Group alone claimed 41 confirmed victories against 6 losses. Across all P-47 units in the 8th Air Force, the numbers painted a picture of transformation. In July 1943, Thunderbolt groups had averaged a kill ratio of 1.2 to 1, barely breaking even. By December, that ratio had climbed to 5.8 to 1. The aircraft had not changed. The engine was the same. The guns were the same. What changed was the way men used the machine. And the Luftwaffe felt every digit of that ratio in blood. January 1944. German intelligence compiled a classified assessment of the American fighter threat.
The report, distributed to Luftwaffe group commanders across Western Europe, contained language that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. The American P-47, it stated, had achieved functional air superiority at altitudes above 25,000 feet. Its structural durability exceeded all German single-engine types by a significant margin. Its firepower, while lacking the destructive power of cannon armament per individual round, delivered a volume of fire that compensated through sustained engagement capability. The report recommended that German pilots avoid prolonged engagement with P-47 formations and instead focus on hit-and-run attacks against unescorted bombers. In plain language, the Luftwaffe was telling its pilots to run from the plane they had been laughing at 9 months ago. But the report contained another assessment that was even more alarming. American industry was producing P-47s at a rate exceeding 600 aircraft per month. Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, employed over 24,000 workers, running 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A second production line at the Curtiss Wright plant in Buffalo, New York, added another 200 aircraft monthly. The Luftwaffe was destroying Thunderbolts at a rate of approximately 30 per month on the Western Front. America was building them 25 times faster than Germany could shoot them down. The German pilots who had survived the autumn of 1943 understood this arithmetic, even if their commanders refused to admit it publicly. Lieutenant Hans Hardigs of JG 26-1 of the Luftwaffe's premier fighter wings wrote in a letter home that month that the American fighters were like a river that cannot be dammed. You shoot one down, and tomorrow there are 3 more in its place, each one flown by a pilot with more training hours than our newest replacements will ever receive. He was not exaggerating. By January 1944, the average American fighter pilot arrived in England with over 300 hours of flight training, including extensive gunnery practice instrument flying and formation tactics. The average Luftwaffe replacement pilot had fewer than 110 hours total with minimal gunnery training due to chronic fuel shortages. The quality gap was widening every month, and the Thunderbolt was the instrument through which that gap became lethal. On January 11, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Mission 311 against aircraft factories deep inside Germany. It was the deepest penetration raid attempted since the Black Thursday disaster 3 months earlier. This time, the bombers did not fly alone. P-47 Thunderbolts, with improved 108-gallon drop tanks, pushed their escort radius to 375 miles, covering the bombers past the Rhine and into the German interior. The Luftwaffe rose to meet them with over 200 fighters. What followed was the largest aerial battle in the European war to that date. Over the skies of Brunswick, Halberstadt, and Oschersleben, American and German fighters clashed in engagements that stretched across 100 miles of sky. The P-47 groups claimed 60 German fighters destroyed. Bomber losses, while still painful at 60 aircraft, were proportionally lower than Black Thursday, because the fighter escort had broken up German attack formations before they could concentrate against the bombers. For the first time, 8th Air Force planners saw the mathematics tipping in their favor. The Thunderbolt was not just protecting bombers, it was killing the Luftwaffe. Every experienced German pilot shot down in January 1944 was a pilot who would not be there to defend against the invasion that everyone knew was coming. And that invasion was now less than 5 months away. The plans for Operation Overlord. The liberation of France were moving from conference rooms to operational orders. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made one requirement absolutely clear. The invasion could not succeed without air superiority over the beaches of Normandy. The Luftwaffe had to be broken before the first soldier stepped onto the sand. That mission fell to the fighters, and the Thunderbolt was about to be asked to do something it had never done before. Not fight at 30,000 feet where it dominated. Not dive from the stratosphere where nothing could catch it. The P-47 was about to be sent down to the deck, 50 feet above the ground, into a world of church steeples, power lines, and anti-aircraft guns that could not miss at point-blank range. It was the most dangerous mission in the air war, and the men who flew it would face a kill rate that made Black Thursday look like a training exercise.
In Part 3, we will follow the Thunderbolt down to the ground into the hedgerows of Normandy, where the real nightmare began, not for the Luftwaffe this time, but for the pilots who had to fly straight into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses ever assembled. And we will meet the men who did it anyway. In Part 1, you watched Alexander Kartveli build a 7-ton fighter that every expert said was too big, too heavy, too slow. In Part 2, you watched Hube Zemke and William Kepner tear up the rulebook and turn that machine into a high-altitude killer that broke the Luftwaffe's grip on the skies above Germany. By January 1944, the P-47 Thunderbolt owned everything above 25,000 feet. German pilots had been ordered to avoid it. Kill ratios had swung from barely even to nearly 6 to 1. The air war was turning. But we ended Part 2 with a warning. The Thunderbolt was about to be sent somewhere it had never been. Not 6 miles above the earth where physics favored it.
Down to 50 feet. Into the hedgerows, the church steeples, the power lines, and the flak batteries of occupied France. Because in the spring of 1944, a date was approaching that would demand everything from every machine and every man the Allies could put into the sky. That date was June 6th, D-Day, and the numbers that came before it were terrifying. Allied intelligence estimated that the Germans had deployed over 8,000 anti-aircraft guns along the coast of northern France. 8,000. At low altitude, a P-47, flying at 350 miles per hour, covered roughly 500 feet per second. A skilled flak crew could track, aim, and fire in under 3 seconds. The mathematics of ground attack were simple, brutal, and unforgiving. For every 100 sorties flown below 1,000 feet, planners expected to lose between 8 and 12 aircraft. Those were not estimates pulled from theory. Those were predictions built on the bodies of pilots who had already tried. In early 1944, Luftwaffe Field Marshal Erhard Milch received an intelligence briefing that changed the tone of every conversation at German Air Ministry headquarters in Berlin. The report detailed the expansion of American P-47 units in England, now numbering 15 fighter groups with over 1,200 operational aircraft. But the alarming section was not about numbers. It was about mission profiles. German signals intelligence had intercepted American tactical communications, indicating that Thunderbolt groups were training for a new role: low-altitude interdiction, strafing, bridge busting, rail cutting, ground attack on a scale that no single-engine fighter force had ever attempted. Milch ordered an immediate reassessment of anti-aircraft deployments along the Atlantic Wall. Flak battalions were reinforced. Light 20 mm and 37 mm guns, the deadliest weapons against low-flying aircraft, were repositioned to cover road junctions, rail yards, and bridge approaches. German commanders understood what was coming. The Americans were preparing to use their most powerful fighter as a flying cannon aimed directly at the Wehrmacht supply lines. The question was whether the Thunderbolt could survive the environment that waited for it on the deck. The Luftwaffe's own ground attack pilots, flying FW-190F variants in the East, suffered loss rates that averaged 14% per month. At that rate, an entire staffel could be wiped out in less than 8 weeks. German planners assumed the Americans would face similar attrition. They assumed wrong, but the transition to ground attack was not seamless, and the problems that emerged nearly derailed the entire program. The P-47 had been designed to fight at altitude. Its turbocharger system, the engineering marvel that gave it dominance above 25,000 feet, became a vulnerability at 50 feet. The turbo ducting ran along the belly of the aircraft, exposed and fragile. A single rifle bullet through the exhaust pipe could cause catastrophic failure. Worse, the belly-mounted system meant the aircraft could not carry bombs on a centerline rack without modification. Republic aviation engineers worked around the clock through February and March 1944 to develop wing-mounted bomb racks and underwing pylons capable of carrying 500-pound general-purpose bombs or 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets. The modifications added weight and drag, reducing the aircraft's already limited low-altitude maneuverability. Pilots who had spent months mastering the boom and zoom tactics of high-altitude combat were told to forget everything they had learned. No more diving from 6 miles up. No more fighting in the thin, clean air where the Thunderbolt was king. Now they would fly at treetop height, navigate by road signs and river bends, and press attacks against targets defended by gunners who could see the rivets on their wings. The transition was brutal. In March 1944, training accidents during low-level qualification killed 11 pilots across 3 fighter groups. Collisions with terrain power lines and trees accounted for most losses. One squadron commander in the 78th Fighter Group reported that his pilots were more afraid of the English countryside than they were of the Luftwaffe. Internal resistance was fierce. Several experienced flight leaders, men with multiple aerial victories, formally requested transfers to units that would remain in the air superiority role. They viewed ground attack as a waste of the Thunderbolt's capabilities and a death sentence for its pilots. The debate reached 8th Fighter Command headquarters, where Kepner shut it down with characteristic bluntness. Every fighter group would be qualified for ground attack. Every pilot would fly the missions assigned. The invasion required it. End of discussion. But beneath the command authority, a genuine tactical question lingered. Could a 7-ton fighter designed for the stratosphere survive in the deadliest airspace on Earth June 6, 1944? 0530 hours. The English Channel. The largest armada ever assembled moves south through darkness and spray. Aboard 5000 ships, 156,000 soldiers prepare to assault the beaches of Normandy. Above them, the sky belongs to the Allies. The 11,000 aircraft fill the air from sea level to 30,000 feet. And among them, more than 500 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 9th Air Force cross the French coast at dawn. Their mission is not air superiority. Their mission is destruction. The 365th Fighter Group call sign, Hellhawks, reaches the beachhead at 0615. Below them, Omaha Beach is chaos. German machine guns rake the waterline. American infantry is pinned against the seawall. Landing craft burn in the shallows. The request comes through at 0638. Ground controller voice tight with urgency. Targets are German strongpoints on the bluffs above the beach. Concrete bunkers. Machine gun nests. Mortar positions pouring fire onto men who have nowhere to hide. Captain James G. Wells rolls his Thunderbolt inverted and pulls toward the earth. Behind him, 11 more P-47s follow. They come in at 200 feet. The bluffs fill the windscreen. Wells opens fire. 8.50 caliber guns send 80 rounds per second into the concrete and earth above Omaha. The tracers walk across the German positions like fingers of light. Dirt erupts. Concrete chips fly. A bunker aperture disappears in a cloud of dust and fragmented stone.
Wells pulls up hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Behind him, the next Thunderbolt is already firing, and the next, and the next. 12 aircraft, 96 guns, delivering a concentrated storm of lead that no infantry position can withstand. On the beach below, soldiers who had been pressed flat against the sand for over an hour hear the roar of the Pratt & Whitney engines and look up. The Thunderbolts are so low that men can see the gun ports flashing. They can feel the pressure waves of the diving aircraft. For the first time that morning, the German fire slackens. Not because the defenders are destroyed, because they are ducking. In those seconds of suppression, American infantry begins to move. Small groups push forward. Engineers reach the seawall. The first breaches open in the German line. By noon, on June 6th, P-47 groups have flown 543 ground attack sorties over the Normandy beachhead. They have hit bunkers, trench systems, artillery positions, vehicle parks, and road junctions. They have fired over 200,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and dropped 188 tons of bombs. German reinforcements attempting to reach the coast are caught in the open. A column of the 12th SS Panzer Division, moving north toward the beaches through the village of Villers-Bocage, is spotted by a flight of 4 Thunderbolts from the 404th Fighter Group at 1340 hours. The lead pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Leo Moon, counts 17 vehicles, including armored half-tracks and supply trucks. He calls his flight in. The first pass shreds the lead vehicle and the rear truck, simultaneously blocking the road. The second pass works through the trapped column methodically. 8 guns per aircraft, 4 aircraft, 32 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tearing through engine blocks, fuel tanks, and ammunition stores. In 4 minutes, 11 vehicles are burning. The surviving crews abandon their machines and scatter into the hedgerows. The column never reaches the beach. German after-action reports from June 6th reflect a command structure in shock. Units that had expected to counterattack the landings within hours found themselves unable to move in daylight. Every road, every intersection, every bridge within 30 miles of the coast was under constant surveillance by American fighters. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit close enough to strike the beaches on D-Day itself, lost 23 vehicles to air attack before it could assemble for a coordinated assault. Its commanding officer reported that movement was impossible during daylight hours without accepting crippling losses. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had warned for months that the invasion would be decided in the first 24 hours, saw his prophecy fulfilled in the worst possible way. The hours he needed to move his reserves to the coast were the same hours that the Thunderbolts owned the sky. The weeks following D-Day amplified the devastation into a strategic catastrophe for the German army in France. Between June 6th and July 31st, 1944, P-47 groups of the 9th Air Force flew over 40,000 combat sorties in direct support of ground operations. They destroyed or damaged an estimated 400 motor vehicles, 261 locomotives, 184 railway cars, and 473 armored vehicles. The loss rate, while painful, was lower than pre-invasion estimates. Approximately 420 Thunderbolts were lost to all causes during those 8 weeks, a rate of just over 1% per sortie. Republic Aviation replaced every one of them within days. The impact on German operations was measured not just in destroyed equipment, but in paralyzed logistics. The Wehrmacht's supply system in Normandy, dependent on road and rail networks that had functioned efficiently for 4 years, collapsed under the weight of continuous air interdiction. Fuel that should have reached panzer divisions sat in depots 50 miles behind the lines because no truck driver would move in daylight. Ammunition reserves dwindled. Replacement troops arriving at the front reported journeys that should have taken hours stretching into days as they hid from aircraft during daylight and moved only after dark. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzerlehr Division, one of Germany's finest armored formations, described the experience of being caught by Thunderbolts during the advance to Normandy in terms that read like a horror account.
He reported losing 84 half-tracks 40 fuel trucks and 5 tanks before his division ever engaged an Allied soldier. By the time Panzerlehr reached the front, it was at 60% strength. It had been destroyed not by Sherman tanks or artillery barrages, but by 7-ton fighters carrying 8 machine guns and 500-pound bombs. The Thunderbolt had become the most feared weapon in the Allied arsenal, not because it was the most technologically advanced, but because it was everywhere. German soldiers coined a phrase for the experience of being caught in the open by American fighters. They called it Jabotod, fighter death. It was not poetic. It was not dramatic. It was a simple acknowledgement that the sky had become the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield. The recognition came swiftly. In July 1944, General Eisenhower personally visited 9th Air Force headquarters to commend the fighter-bomber groups. He told assembled commanders that the success of the ground campaign was inseparable from the work done at treetop height by men flying P-47s. Hub Zemke's 56th Fighter Group, still operating in the air superiority role with the 8th Air Force, finished the summer of 1944 as the highest-scoring American fighter unit in Europe, with over 500 confirmed aerial victories. The 365th Hellhawks earned a Distinguished Unit Citation for their work over the beaches. Across the theater, Thunderbolt pilots received more decorations per capita than any other fighter type in the Army Air Forces. Alexander Kartvelli, watching from Long Island as production reports crossed his desk, allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. The machine they had called the Jug, the iron bathtub. The flying milk bottle had become the backbone of Allied tactical air power in Europe. It had done what no one believed it could do. Not just fight at altitude, but fight at 50 feet, absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, and return, day after day, to a war that consumed machines and men at a rate that would have broken a lesser design. But this story has one more chapter, because the war did not end in Normandy, and the Thunderbolt's greatest test was still ahead. In the winter of 1944, when the German army launched its last desperate offensive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the P-47 would be called upon one final time to do the impossible. And the man who designed it, the quiet Georgian who never raised his voice, would watch from half a world away as his creation faced a battle that would determine whether everything he built was enough. What happened in those frozen skies above the bulge, and what became of the men and machines that fought there, is a story that few people know. And it is the story we will tell in Part 4. From a quiet drafting table in Farmingdale, Long Island, a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartvelli designed a fighter that every expert called a flying joke. Too big, too heavy, too slow. In Part 1, you watched that machine nearly kill its own pilots before it ever saw combat. In Part 2, you watched a handful of stubborn commanders rewrite the rules of air warfare and turn the Thunderbolt into the most feared predator above 25,000 feet. In Part 3, you watched it descend to 50 feet and tear the German army apart across the hedgerows of Normandy. 546,000 combat sorties, 132,000 tons of bombs, 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed. But we ended Part 3 with a promise. We said there was one more chapter set in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. In the winter of 1944, when the German army made its final desperate gamble, and the Thunderbolt was called upon to do the impossible one last time. We said we would tell you what happened to the men and machines that fought there. And we said there was a twist at the end of the story that almost nobody knows. Here it is. December 16th, 1944, 0530 hours. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. 200,000 German soldiers supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns launch a surprise offensive through 70 miles of thinly held American lines. The attack catches Allied intelligence completely off guard. Within 48 hours, German spearheads have penetrated 30 miles into Allied territory, encircling entire divisions, cutting supply lines, and threatening to split the Allied armies in half. It is the largest German offensive on the Western Front since 1940. And for the first 5 days, the Thunderbolt cannot help. Fog, snow, clouds so thick that pilots sitting in their cockpits at bases across eastern France and Belgium cannot see the end of the runway. The weather that concealed the German buildup now shields the German advance. On the ground, American soldiers fight alone. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division is surrounded. Fuel dumps burn, field hospitals overflow, casualties mount by the hour. Every morning, 9th Air Force commanders stare at weather reports and curse. 15 fighter groups, over 1,000 Thunderbolts sit on the ground, loaded with bombs and ammunition, unable to fly. The men at Bastogne cannot wait much longer. December 23rd, 1944. The sky clears. The temperature drops to -15 degrees. And the Thunderbolts launch. Every available P-47 in the theater takes to the air. The 365th Hellhawks, the 362nd, the 406th, the 368th. Groups that had spent 5 days pacing, planning, and memorizing target maps now pour across the frozen landscape of the bulge in waves. The effect is immediate. German armored columns that had moved freely under cloud cover are caught in the open on snow-covered roads with nowhere to hide. The white fields that had concealed nothing now reveal everything. Every tank, every truck, every artillery piece. Dark shapes on a white canvas, visible from 10,000 feet. The first strikes hit the lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, which had advanced to within 4 miles of the Meuse River crossings at Dinant. If those crossings fell, the German plan to split the Allied armies would succeed. 4 P-47s from the 406th Fighter Group found the division's forward column stretched along a narrow road between Celles and Foy-Notre-Dame. The lead pilot rolled in. 8 guns fired. The first truck exploded. The last vehicle in the column died seconds later. The road was blocked at both ends. Then the killing began. For 20 minutes, flights of Thunderbolts rotated over the trapped column, methodically destroying everything that moved. Tanks that attempted to leave the road bogged down in snow-covered fields and became stationary targets. Fuel trucks detonated in fireballs visible for miles. Ammunition carriers exploded with secondary blasts that shattered trees 100 yards away. By nightfall, the 2nd Panzer Division had lost 82 tanks, 441 vehicles, and all forward momentum. It never reached the Meuse. The German offensive reached its high watermark that day and began to recede. In the week that followed, Thunderbolt groups flew over 10,000 sorties across the bulge, destroying an estimated 600 armored vehicles, 7,000 motor vehicles, and 550 gun positions. The loss rate was savage. 128 P-47s shot down in 7 days. But the replacements came. They always came. Fresh aircraft rolled off transports and onto hardstands before the wreckage of the lost machines had cooled. The German army had no such luxury. Every tank burning on an Ardennes road was a tank that would never be replaced. Every experienced crew killed was experience that died with them. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German offensive had failed, and the Thunderbolt had played a role in breaking it that no other weapon could have filled. When the war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, the men who had flown, built, and commanded the P-47 Thunderbolt scattered into the enormous silence that follows a global conflict. Their fates were as varied as the war itself. Robert S. Johnson, the grocery clerk from Oklahoma, who survived 221 bullet holes over Normandy, finished the war with 27 confirmed aerial victories, making him one of the top American aces in Europe. He returned to the United States, joined Republic Aviation as a test pilot and executive, and spent decades working with the company that had built the machine that saved his life. He rarely spoke about June 26, 1943. When asked, he would say only that the airplane brought him home and that he owed it everything else. Hub Zemke, the iron-willed commander of the 56th Fighter Group, did not finish the war in triumph. On October 30th, 1944, his P-47 broke apart in a violent thunderstorm over Germany. He survived the bailout and spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 1.
He was liberated in May 1945, returned to active duty, and served through the Korean War before retiring as a colonel. He never received the general's star that many believed he deserved. The man who had done more than perhaps anyone to prove the Thunderbolt in combat spent his later years in quiet retirement in Oroville, California, where he died in 1994 at the age of 80.
The pilots who did not come back left smaller traces. 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts were built during the war. 5,222 were lost to all causes. Each one carried a man. Many of those men have no graves, no memorials, no names that appear in any book that a casual reader would find. They exist in unit records, in squadron diaries, in letters that were never answered. They were farmers and mechanics teachers, and store clerks' boys from small towns who climbed into a 7-ton machine and flew it into the most dangerous skies on Earth because someone asked them to. And Alexander Kartveli, the quiet Georgian who designed the aircraft that changed the air war, watched the conflict end from his office in Farmingdale. He received no Medal of Freedom. He appeared on no magazine covers. His name was not mentioned in Eisenhower's victory speeches or Truman's addresses to the nation. He simply went back to his drafting table and began working on the next project. Because for Kartveli, the Thunderbolt was never the end. It was a step, but the legacy he left behind was not measured in awards. It was measured in what came next. The P-47. Thunderbolt did not retire quietly. After the war, surplus Thunderbolts were sold or transferred to air forces around the world. Brazil, China, France, Iran, Turkey, Yugoslavia, and more than a dozen other nations operated the aircraft well into the 1950s. The Brazilian Air Force flew P-47s in combat during the Italian campaign and maintained them in frontline service until 1957. The French Air Force used them in Indochina. The design philosophy that Kartveli had pioneered, heavy firepower, structural durability, and a massive radial engine, did not disappear with the propeller age. It evolved. Kartveli himself took the lessons of the Thunderbolt and applied them to the next generation. His F-84 Thunderjet became the workhorse of the Korean War, flying 86, 408 combat sorties, and delivering more ordnance than any other United Nations aircraft in the conflict. His F-105 Thunderchief, a direct descendant of the P-47's philosophy of size power and payload, became the primary strike aircraft of the Vietnam War, flying 75% of all bombing missions against North Vietnam between 1965 and 1968. The lineage was unmistakable. Each aircraft was bigger than its predecessor. Each carried more weapons. Each absorbed more punishment. Each was initially criticized as too heavy and too large. And each proved its critics wrong in combat. The total statistics of the P-47 in World War II remain staggering by any measure. Republic Aviation built 15,683 Thunderbolts, making it the most produced American fighter of the war. P-47 units claimed 3,752 enemy aircraft, destroyed in air-to-air combat, and over 3,000 more on the ground. They destroyed 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, and 68,000 motor vehicles. They flew 546,000 combat sorties and dropped 132,000 tons of bombs. The aircraft's loss rate in combat was 0.7% per sortie, the lowest of any American fighter in the European theater. For every Thunderbolt lost in combat, the P-47 destroyed 4.6 enemy aircraft in the air, a ratio that validated every design decision Kartveli had made. The deeper lesson of the Thunderbolt was never about rivets and horsepower. It was about the courage to pursue an idea that every reasonable voice said was wrong. In 1940, Alexander Kartveli proposed building the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter in history at a moment when every trend in aviation pointed toward smaller, lighter, more agile designs. He was told it was too big. He was told it would not maneuver. He was told pilots would hate it. He built it anyway. History is filled with moments like this.
Moments when the unconventional path turned out to be the only path that led to victory. Percy Spencer, a factory worker with no college degree, accidentally discovered that microwave radiation could cook food while working on radar equipment and created the microwave oven. Barnes Wallis proposed bouncing bombs off water to destroy German dams and was ridiculed by the Air Ministry for months before the dambusters' raid proved him right. Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet lieutenant colonel, ignored his own country's early warning systems and single-handedly prevented a nuclear war by trusting his judgment over his instruments. In every case, the pattern is the same. An individual sees something that the system cannot see. The system resists. The individual persists. And the world changes. Today, the principle that Kartveli embedded in the Thunderbolt, that survivability and firepower matter more than agility, is the foundation of every modern ground attack aircraft in service. The A-10 Thunderbolt, the A-2, the United States Air Force's legendary tank killer, carries the P-47's name deliberately. Its designers studied the original Thunderbolt's combat record and built an aircraft around the same philosophy. Heavy armor, massive firepower, the ability to absorb catastrophic damage and keep flying. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, mounted in the A-10's nose, is the spiritual descendant of those 8.50 caliber Brownings that spoke in unison over the skies of France 80 years ago. The conversation between past and present has never stopped. And there is one final detail that almost nobody knows. In 1945, as the war ended and production lines shut down, the last P-47 Thunderbolt rolled off the assembly line at Republic Aviation's Farmingdale factory. It was a P-47N, the ultimate variant, with extended wings, increased fuel capacity, and a range that could finally match the distances of the Pacific Theater. That aircraft, serial number 45-49295, was delivered to the Army Air Forces and assigned to a unit preparing for the invasion of Japan. It never saw combat. The atomic bombs ended the war before it could fly its first mission. But here's the twist. Decades later, aviation historians traced the fate of that final Thunderbolt. It had been sold as surplus stripped of its military equipment and passed through a series of private owners who used it for air racing crop dusting and eventually abandoned it in a field in South America. In 1999, a restoration team recovered the wreckage. After 12 years of painstaking work, the last Thunderbolt ever built flew again in 2011, 66 years after it rolled out of the factory. It now sits in a museum, fully restored its Republic Aviation badges, polished its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, capable of turning over at the push of a button. The very last Jug, built for a war that ended before it could fight, survived long enough to become a monument to every pilot, every mechanic, every factory worker, and every stubborn engineer who refused to believe that bigger meant weaker and heavier meant slower. From a Georgian immigrant with a drafting pencil and an idea that every expert called insane, to 546,000 combat sorties, 3,752 enemy aircraft, destroyed 132,000 tons of bombs, delivered, and a loss rate so low that it rewrote the textbooks on fighter design. Alexander Kartveli never received the fame of his contemporaries. Hub Zemke never got his General Star. Robert Johnson never fully escaped the memory of those 221 holes. And 222 Thunderbolts never came home at all. But together, they proved something that matters far beyond the boundaries of any single war. They proved that the world's most powerful weapon is not the one that looks the deadliest. It is the one that refuses to die. 15,683 Thunderbolts were built. Each one carried the same message into the sky, written not in words, but in steel, in fire, and in the unbreakable will of the people who made them fly. That message was simple. You can laugh at us, you can doubt us, you can shoot us full of holes, but we are coming back tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day after that until this is over. If you know another story from World War II, where an idea everyone called crazy changed the course of history, share it in the comments. This is only one of hundreds of innovations that emerged from the most destructive conflict in human history.
Subscribe to hear the ones that nobody talks about. Because the greatest stories are never the ones that made the headlines. They are the ones that were buried in classified files, forgotten in factory records, and carried home in the memories of men who never thought anyone would ask. Until someone did.